And I actually wanted to open up with a different reading. So let me pull up the PowerPoints. Okay, here, Exodus 28:4. And I wanted to focus mostly on the breast piece, which is called the choshen. Choshen. And if you look it up in scripture, as far as using the Strongs to try to cross-reference other places you may have seen that root word used, you're going to have a hard time because this is about the only context for a choshen. Now, there are some rabbis who will go to a 2-letter root if they can't find an adequate explanation from a 3-letter root, which is called a shoresh. And we'll look at what a shoresh is tonight. That has nothing to do really with verb roots. But some rabbis will say you can go even beyond that. There are 2-letter roots in Hebrew. Just like there's certain verbs that when you conjugate them, they're only going to have 2 letters in their conjugated form. They won't have 3. And so you can do that with choshen. You can think about it and say, well, that nun on the end of the word could be a construct that could have been added. Sometimes a tav or a nun are added to the end of the word to make it more of a permanent construct, or to change the part of speech slightly. It's a grammar thing. But when you really start searching on choshen, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the 3-letter root, the shoresh, or whether you're looking at the 2-letter root. It's confusing because it's hard to find exactly what the context of it is outside of it simply being a breastplate that's made part of the ephod. So it can still be an interesting study because I think it does have to do with, it's a specific context we're going to have for it is judgment. It's going to be called the breastplate of judgment, or the choshen, mishpat. Of course, mishpat is a judgment. And eventually, either this class or the next one, we'll get to a place where maybe we can wrap our minds around the mishpat of judgment, because we do have some other contexts for that. But in Exodus 28:14, or 28:4, excuse me, it says, these are the garments which they shall make: a breast piece, which is a choshen, and an ephod, and a robe, and a tunic of checkered work, a turban, and a sash. And they shall make holy garments for Aharon your brother and his sons, that he may minister as a priest to me. So basically, these garments are going to pervade the Torah portion. They're even a prerequisite for what we were reading at the end of the Torah portion, where it's talking about, at the time of the cleaning and the lighting of the lamps and so forth, and when he adds the incense altar specifications, at that time, you already have witnessed through the portion the ordination of the priests with their respective garments, including Aharon's garments that has all these beautiful things on it. Let's see. I wanted to be really careful about taking photographs out of that book that I showed you, but I took a few, and because of copyright issues, I didn't want to just take pictures of every single page that related to what we were talking about. So I made a few pictures so you could get the idea. And on that breastplate, of course, you can see in the background the different colors there, the blue, the purple, and the red that are interwoven there. And then it's also going to have some gold threads that are woven in there. But you can see the Hebrew transliteration of the different stones. And there's one stone there that you should recognize. It's at the very bottom row in the middle, which is the Shoham stone. And the first mention of our Shoham stone, remember, was in Genesis 2, within the rivers of Eden. It talked about how good gold was there. And then also in the good gold, it says, was Delium stone and Shoham stone. And so now we see it on reappearing on the Choshen, and it's being carried on the heart of the high priest as a remembrance of the tribes. There's another stone there that we didn't necessarily read in the beginning chapters of Bereshit, but we read in a recent Torah portion, we read about the sapphire stone, which in Hebrew is sapir. And it's in the second row in the middle. And it looks like, who is that? Yisachar? Looks like the sapphire goes to Yisachar there. But that was supposed to have been the substance, not just of the sapphire brickwork that they saw coming out from under the throne, but also the substance of the Luchot, the Ten Commandments, the 2 tablets. And so it's pretty well set in the center as well. Now let's look at these measurements, and you heard it, and that's why I read out of this art scroll, because sometimes they will transliterate words that we won't get in the NASB or in the KJV. And when we're finding patterns, sometimes that's helpful, because over the past several weeks, we've seen a specific Hebrew word come up, and that is amah, transliterated A-M-A-H. And we saw in its context, it's not just a measurement like you would have on a tape measure, but it also seems to be relative to Shabbat in some way. Remember the 2,000 amot of a Sabbath day's journey? And then Pharaoh's daughter, it said she stretched basically her amah to Moses. So it seems to, as it rotates through some of the measurements that are given in Hebrew, to somehow overlap what we're supposed to understand about Shabbat. And in this particular context, later as we got into the Torah portion there at the end, it started specifically saying anamah, but at this place where it's describing the Choshen, it switches over and it starts using a different measure, but that measure is relative to the amah. It has meaning relative to the amah. So it says the Choshen was woven 1 amah, which is approximately 2 feet high, and 1/2 amah, which is approximately 1 foot wide. So that's really easy to imagine. And then it took that rectangle and it folded it in half in order to form a pocket. So your finished Choshen is going to be 1/2 amah square. And it's going to be centered on the high priest's chest over his heart, and it's going to be suspended from these cables or chains hung from the straps of the ephod. Now, probably in English you've heard of ephod, so either way. But a ephod doesn't have to be strictly this garment made for the high priest. You'll see other places in scripture where an ephod pops up, like David wore an ephod. Sometimes they would use an ephod for not so good purposes. They could be used relative to idol worship. You can take anything holy and distort its function. But this is going to be the one worn by the high priest. And it had to be hung from the ephod by chains and rings. So if we think of that amot that's being described here, and in this particular context, not in the one we read, But in this one, it uses zoet, and a zeret is half an amah. So if an amah can represent some measurement of Shabbat, I don't know that we've completely hammered that out yet. We just know it seems to keep circling around when we get to a Shabbat topic. But if an amah can represent a measurement of Shabbat, then what's interesting here is that it takes two, an inner and an outer, to form the pocket of the Urim and the Tumim, as well as the filling stones. And we tend to think of Urim and Tumim as two separate objects, but the commentaries are telling us Urim and remember where it said good gold in Genesis 2? And they said, no, the construct of that is that of a proper noun. It's not really saying there was gold there and the quality was good. It was saying there was an entity, a people, some sort of seed prophecy of people who would be called good gold. So in this context, the Urim and the Tumim, they say because of the grammar of the way that it's used, even though we're reading it as two things, it's one thing. And it, of course, the plurals, it's going to translate out as lights, Urim, and perfections, Tumim. Lights and perfections, whatever that turns out to be. So again, we've got the amah, which was a unit of measurement associated with the Shabbat. We've got Pharaoh's daughter extending her arm to reach Moses, representing someone who is not born among the 12 tribes, but yet has an association with. And it says, the choshen, it shall be square. And that's the measurement there, that it has to be folded with a half amah, its length, with, and a half amah, its width, once it's folded out. So it's a perfect square. And the idea is there's two layers. There's an inner layer, which is going to be unseen, and then there's going to be that outer layer, which is where you're going to have the gemstones embedded. Here's the representation possibly of the colors they would have had. And you'll notice that there's extra words up on Reuven. It's going to start in the upper right-hand side because Hebrew goes right to left, and that's the way that they're arranging the names there. And you notice in the lower left-hand side, they've got Benjamin. And there's some extra lettering on there, and I've got a picture there where you can pull up and you can see what it says. And really all it says there on Reuven, who's going to be the first. Okay, I'm seeing some stuff pop up in the chat box. Let me check. Oh, okay, you guys are just commenting. We'll get back to that. You can see on Reuven, where it begins, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have been included in that. And then as you work your way down to the last of the 12 tribes, Benjamin, it says there in Hebrew, the tribes of Yeshurun. Yeshurun. And remember, Yeshurun is the kind of a nickname or an affectionate name for Israel when they're behaving themselves, because Yeshar means straight, upright. And so with those two, I don't know if I want to call them extra because I don't know if they were actually there or not, but with those added things there, each letter of the Hebrew Aleph Beit appears on that choshen. And there's a close-up where you can see what they believe was also there. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then Reuven connects that line. And then Benjamin sums it up as these are the tribes of Yeshurun. These are the straight tribes. So what we want to look for, and there's lots of them in this Torah portion, is contronyms. Those of you who've been studying with me a while, you already know what a contronym is. But for those of you who are new, a contronym is a word that functions as its own opposite. An English example, a good English example, is cleave, because it can both mean to separate or to attach tightly. Which one is it? It depends on your context. You have to read the sentence in context to know whether someone is asking you to get closer or you better get away. And so that's the way a contronym works. You have to know how that Hebrew word is used in its context to know whether you're reading something in a positive or negative implication, with that implication. And so one thing I wanted to bring out was in the Choshen, there are gemstones. We looked at those 12 gemstones in the pictures. And there's an interesting way that it's worded. We might say that, you know, these are the gemstones, or these are the precious stones. The way that it's worded in Hebrew is using a root male or mala. There's actually another way that it's used, and we're going to see that in reference to how the ram of ordination is described. He's going to have the same root applied to his role in the consecration of the priests. But for now, let's look at these stones, because male, as it describes the Choshen stones, it means to fill or be full of. Right? You know, you're not supposed to overhear, well, you know, I mean, sometimes you can't help but overhear gossip, but you're not supposed to actively listen in. But in a crowded cafeteria, sometimes you're just stuck next to who you're stuck with. And I remember when I was in Ulpan Akiva in Netanya, I was sitting beside the teachers. The teachers came and sat down beside me at lunch. And one of them was having boyfriend problems. And I kept hearing this word over and over. She kept saying, lo male, lo male. And it finally dawned on me, she's griping about her boyfriend because he says things and doesn't do them. And so, I mean, I don't know how that relationship ended up, but that's how I remembered that word. Sometimes just a weird event will connect a word. And so now when I see that root, male, I always think of she wasn't my teacher, she was a teacher. But say, you know, my boyfriend, he says things and he doesn't do them. He doesn't accomplish what he says he's going to do. Lo male. So male or mala, it means to accomplish it, to do it, to fill it up, to confirm something. Let's look down there. Even to overflow. Remember Rebecca and Rachel, you know, filling up a pitcher, filling up something to overflowing, making something completely full. You can't add any more. That's how full it is. And so these stones, the way we're supposed to think of them is that in the gold settings, there were indentations. And then the stones had to be cut to exactly fill up the indentation. The idea of their function is that they are filling stones. When you read that with a Hebrew mindset, you don't just say, oh, those were, you know, gemstones, or they were in their settings. That was a bulldog sneeze. But the idea is the stones feel something. They accomplish something. They're not just sitting there like pretty things. They're actually accomplishing something in that setting. They're filling it up. So let's take those same roots, male, and let's look at the contronym, or the positive aspect of the contronym of male. Now, obviously in the Choshen, if you're looking at how the gemstones fill up the breastplate, how they fill up the Choshen, how they fulfill its purpose, that's obviously a positive context. There's other contexts. So I thought, let's try first mention. Sometimes your first mention will give you the best definition and context. And then we'll take one more. We'll take the very next time on the list. In order to do progressive mention, it means you take that same word that you're trying to figure out, and you go through one by one every single time it's used in scripture, and that gives you context. And when you're done doing all that, you've done progressive mention, and then you have reached complete mention. Now, we're not going to do that. That would take a long time because this root is used a lot. But I'm going to give you two positive first and second mention examples. It says in Genesis 1:22, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill, there's the root male, which is going to be the Strong's 4390, fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. So that whole context that surrounds male, it has to do with filling something up. The waters and the seas, the birds multiplying on the earth, and so forth. So that is going to be, I believe, the 5th day of creation, because that's when your fish and your birds are created. And the next mention is on day 6. So it's on 2 consecutive days. You're going to get the first mention and the second mention. It says in 128, it says, God blessed, hang on a sec. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill, male, the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So we've got a 2-step plan here. When this root, male, is introduced to us, it's first introduced in a context of filling something up, birds and fish. And then the next mention says, okay, those things that are filling up, I'm going to add to it. I'm going to add the living creatures, because remember, the beasts and the human beings were created on the 6th day. He says, I want you to do that. And in both cases, they are blessed. This is going to come about because of a blessing. So he says, I want the same thing to happen. I want you to be fruitful. I want you to multiply. I want you to fill the earth. But he adds something. Subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So the more complete understanding of male from a human being standpoint, it's not just reproduction, it's taking authority and taking responsibility for the creation. So in that filling up of the earth, we have to be responsible. We have to do those things that are necessary so that the filling up and the completion of the purpose can actually take place. So look at the context of it on day 5 and 6. We see that it required a blessing. We see that part of the filling, since we're going to be talking about the filling station, we have to be fruitful and multiply. And then as it expands, it says to subdue the earth and to rule over the creatures of the earth. So take that same context of Male as it applies to the 5th and 6th days of creation, and now just overlay it onto the Hoshen, onto the breastplate, because it was the gemstones that filled the gold. Think about that for just a second. I want that to sink in. It was the gemstones that filled the gold. Whatever was going on with that good gold on the breastplate, it wasn't filled up. It hadn't fulfilled its purpose until the gemstones filled it up. And that should be kind of like a little pop-up book in your head. It should have more definition for you now than just saying, well, the gemstones were set in gold. That's pretty. It's more than pretty, it's functional. Because remember, Torah is prophecy. The Torah is the prophecy, and the prophets are its legs. So we could see in Genesis 1, chapter 1, prophecy of what it means to fulfill and to fill. And then adjacent to it, for a human being, we add that we are supposed to have authority and rulership over this earth to help it fulfill that purpose. So how do we fill up the good gold of Genesis chapter 2? We have to have the blessing in order to ensure that there's fruitfulness, that there is multiplication, and that we are able to subdue the earth and to rule over the creatures. And we know that after the fall, the biggest creature of all was the one inside of us. It was the beast. It was that which now comes into conflict with the spirit of Elohim who created us. So the idea possibly of putting the Shoham stone, and the idea like the rivers had significance to them, like the Pishon River, where they say the Pishon is how you make the linen garments. So there was a beginning there of a prophecy of how the gemstones eventually would fulfill their purpose. But let's also look at the other side of the contronym, because if there's a good side, there's a bad side. Genesis 6:11 and 13 says the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled, male, with violence. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Okay, so let's just apply an opposite to that. We could say, okay, this is the bad side of Male, because instead of the earth being filled up with that purpose of multiplying, being fruitful, good things happening, basically, if we're subduing the beast, right, then we're subduing the soul. The spirit has control of the soul. The reverse has occurred in Genesis 6. Now the soul's appetite, emotion, desire, intellect, which is where the violence of Hamas comes from. Now violence is filling. And so those precious things have almost ceased to be at that point. There's no way that they can fulfill their purpose, because instead those places that needed filling have been filled up with violence. And so he says, I'm going to destroy them with the earth. I'm going to destroy the people. Why? They're not fulfilling their purpose. If you're a gemstone, you have to fulfill your purpose. Right? It's not just something pretty. There's a function that you have to perform. So the the vacuum there, when we fail to fulfill that function, it's filled by violence. It's filled by chamas. It's filled by the actions of a beast, because that's really all they want to do, is they want to eat, drink, sleep, procreate, and fight each other so they have more opportunities to do those things. So instead of the earth being filled according to good purpose, according to its setting of good gold, the opposite has happened. Here's context. And I took this out of Jacenius, Hebrew Chaldee lexicon. And we're still talking about the Hebrew root, or shoresh, which is male, which is what the gemstones had to do in the breastplate. They had to male, they had to fill up according to purpose. And in the lexicon, male, it means to make full, but it also, more than once, has a context of using a bow. Keshet is a rainbow, but it's also a weapon, a bow. So male can mean to fill your hand with a bow. It can also mean to bend a bow very strongly as a weapon of war. So I get back to some of the earlier mentions of keshet, which now has an association with male. We know that the bow was set in the sky after the flood as a sign. But we also know that that bow is formed, at least to our vision. Now the white light coming through it cannot be seen. But once it's bent through the water, then we see the 7 colors of the rainbow, which correspond to the 7 spirits of Adonai. And I gave you an example from 2 Kings 9:24. It says, and Yehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Jehoram between his arms, and the arrow went through his heart, and he sank, which the Hebrew word there means to kneel. He knelt in his chariot. So what did Yehu do? He drew his bow with his full strength, male. In other words, that bowstring was so tight, he couldn't have pulled it any tighter. It was completely at the limit of his strength. And so he didn't let that arrow fly until he had exerted every bit of force he possibly could. So again, put that back in the context of the breastplate, of the choshen, the precious stones. They are to make full, they are filling stones. So when a precious stone fills the gold setting of the choshen, that means they do it with all their might, with all their strength. Does that sound familiar? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Right? So it goes back to the unity of Adonai and keeping his commandments. That's part of the Shema, is you agree to talk about the commandments, to do the commandments, to teach the commandments with all your strength. And so that's the question we have to ask. At what point in my life, let me envision he's in a battle, and the person he's about to shoot actually is the son of Jezebel, if that makes a difference. So he's about to shoot the son of Jezebel, who basically taught Israel how to sin with the Baals. And so when Yehu pulls the bowstrings back, he's putting every bit of his strength into it. when we're doing what the Shema says, we're loving with all our heart, our soul, and our strength, is our bow of love completely full. When we keep the commandments, when we talk about the commandments, when we teach the commandments, can we honestly say that we have stretched that bowstring as far as our strength will allow? Probably not. Probably not, because we're human, right? Ever since we fell out of that garden, we're human. And we have periods where we do have great strength, but we also have periods of weakness where we're not so committed. Our heart is not so into it. Our soul is not so into it. Our strength is not so into it. We tend to have easy commandments and hard commandments, right? There's commandments we do without thinking, and there's commandments we really don't want to think about because we don't want to do them. So here's the context. That's the verse in Hebrew that I just read to you in English, where Jehu kills Jezebel's son, Jehoram. But I did want you to see the root there, mile yado bakeshet. All right, so he made full in his hand of the bow, or with the bow. So we have a context already for somebody driving a chariot, which if you go back up here, you can see that the battle between the two was taking place in chariots. So we have a context for chariots. We know that the throne is described in a chariot-like way because it has these fiery wheels. We also know that there are chariots of fire that can be dispatched to protect us, to surround us. But we also know that there's wicked chariots, such as Pharaoh's army. And remember, the song at the sea boiled all of those chariots and all those soldiers down to one? Because when they sang the song at the sea, they say the horse and its rider thrown into the sea, which makes sense. Because remember, the Egyptians said, once they start seeing the chariot wheel come, singular, that, you know, the God of the Hebrews is fighting against the Egyptians, as if they're not the Egyptians, but they are the Egyptians. Who are they talking about? Well, there seems to be a much more wicked, dark spiritual force that we can identify as Egypt, that we can identify as Pharaoh, and his armies that we can identify as his chariots. And we even get some of that picture in Revelation. So let's go on and look at how that breastplate was hung on the ephod. It says in 28:14, it says, and 2 chains of pure, that's a key, pure gold. You shall make them of twisted cordage work, and you shall put corded chains on the filigree settings. So it's describing the quality of the gold. It's saying pure. But remember, that word there, tahor, which we're translating as pure, that's also the state of a human being who is ritually prepared to go into the tabernacle or the temple. And so I put that on there in Hebrew for you as well, because there's a couple of words associated with that pure or transparent gold. There's a sense of transparency when you hear the word tahor for pure. That doesn't just mean physically clean. In fact, like the washing of the priests for the consecration, the understanding is they would already be clean, physically clean. The immersion that they went through was supposed to be more of a spiritual transformation. So uh, there's a word there that's translated out as chains, used in the context of how are we supposed to make these chains? We're supposed to make them out of pure gold. In one sense, pure gold is also transparent gold. It's gold that is free of blemish and impurity. It has lots of good context. When you start doing word search on that, it doesn't just mean a human being who's in a state of ritual purity, but we can describe it with other qualities as well, like it's pure, it's unmixed, it's undiluted. Like with the oil, when we started out with the reading and it talked about the oil, it talked about the clear oil. And there's basically 3 grades of oil in Scripture based on what we know their ancient practices were. The oil that is tahor, or ritually pure, has been barely pressed. It's been pressed so lightly that when that drop comes out, you don't press it any harder. Because if you press it much harder with different pressing tools, you will get sediment. And you don't want to crush it to that extent. So, in the Hebrew text there, if you want to look at it, I've put it in boldface. And it's describing the chains. So, sharsheret, and then you see the word again the second time in boldface, sharsheret. Okay, so if we say sharsheret, chains, plural, what does that mean? Well, there is a shoresh in the shoreshot. And a shoresh is a root. In fact, when you get into your Hebrew study, if the teacher starts saying things like, what is the shoresh? He's asking you, what is the root of this verb? What are the 3 letters that make up the root of the verb? That's the shoresh. So when you think of a chain, you're supposed to somehow think of something that has a root. It's going to be grounded and connected with something. What does a root of a tree do? It connects it to the earth, right? If you cut the roots, then the tree will no longer be connected. So think of a chain. What holds the breast piece to the ephod? It's going to be the root. It's going to be the chains. Because if you cut the chains, then the breastplate is no longer attached. So the ephod, that gold of the ephod, is going to have to be tahor, a completely pure, transparent gold, ritually pure, to connect the shoulder pieces, which, remember, it's got the name of 6 tribes on one side and 6 tribes on the other side. That's the shoham stone, and then it's going to have this sort of strap that comes down. Then you're going to have the chains, you're going to have the rings, and then you're going to have the choshen, and then the filling stones. So let's look at the chain. I think we looked at this 2 or 3 weeks ago, or maybe we didn't. Maybe I just put it in the newsletter. I couldn't remember. But I want to go back again to the shoresh, like you can see right there, of the chain, and look at some related words. In shir, song. All right? So what is a song? A song is something round. It's circular. Right? It's there's repetition in a song. Even like, You might have verses, but you might also have choruses, those things which are repeated. The Psalms themselves are designed to be sung over and over and over. They weren't designed to be read one time. They were designed to be sung repeatedly. So you get the idea of shir with the same root there of the chain. What does a chain do? It links one thing with another. Okay? So it's the same thing with sharsharet, with a chain. And a chain, if you want to remember the word sharsharet, just think of a chain as being interlinking songs. Right? Songs that join together, because the song is repetitive and it closes itself in a circle. So that same circular concept of a song or of a chain, there's another word in our Torah portion that has a similar idea of something that makes a circular movement. And that word is, and this is not the one in the Torah portion, that word is machol, but you can hear the same root in it, chol. Chol. The special bread we use for Shabbat and the holidays is challah. Challah. Do you hear the machol of dancing with the bread of challah? And challah is in the Torah portion. If you read it in Hebrew, as you get down to the consecration offerings that go with the consecration of the Levites, not the Levites, with the priests, with the Kohanim, one of the offerings that's going to be brought is the chalot. And they said it was a minimum of 10 loaves. But in this particular context, they're going to be unleavened chalot. The chalot we're accustomed to seeing has leaven in it that we use on Shabbat. But you can also make chalot out of matzah, out of unleavened bread. But the root of challah that we use on Shabbat is chol, which means to do that circular movement. Why do we have challah on Shabbat? Because Shabbat goes in a circle. We just go round and around and around. Every 7 days we get a new challah because we get a new Shabbat. So it's like a dance. It's like a song. There's a repetition. There's a chain that connects all these things. So here, Exodus 29, 1 and 2, I want you to at least see the challah in Hebrew. I don't know if the arrows actually worked in this, but it says, now this is what you shall do to them, to consecrate them to minister as priests to me. Take 1 young bull and 2 rams without blemish, and unleavened bread, and unleavened cakes mixed with oil, and unleavened wafers spread with oil. You shall make them of fine wheat flour. So if you look where the purple arrow is, it did come down pretty far. It's giving you 3 types of bread offerings, 3 types of matzah made with fine wheat flour. So it says, Velechem matzot, vechalot matzot, velulot bashemen. So it's with the first 2 things, when we're looking at the matzah that makes up the bread, when we look at the matzah that makes up the challah, the oil there is mixed in with the wheat. But the wafers, what it's calling wafers, it's actually smeared. And did I put, yeah, I did. Okay, that second purple arrow that I put on there, meshuchim. Meshuchim, you can hear the root of Mashiach, which is Messiah. That's one who is smeared over with oil, or one who is anointed, we usually say in English, one who is anointed with oil. So in offering these 3 different types of products made of unleavened wheat flour, probably what we're seeing is 3 aspects of Messiah. One of them has to do with the challah, the unleavened challah. And what does a chol do? It repeats itself. It goes like a dance. It goes around and around and around. So with Mashiach, or Messiah, there's probably some aspect of his nature that it's telling us we should look for somebody who is going to follow this particular dance that was put in motion at the creation. He's not going to make up his own things. He's going to be completely consistent with that original mission, which is to fill the earth, not just to fill it physically, but to take that spiritual authority over the earth so that you can create the favorable conditions for there to be fruitfulness and multiplication. And basically, you know, like the lechem, they say it was made first like a dough and dropped in boiling water till it had kind of that, I would call it more like a dumpling. When you drop bread dough into a thing of boiling water, you end up with basically a dumpling. And then they would take that out, and then they would fry it in oil. So it not only had the oil mixed into the dough itself, it was actually fried in oil. So you can see in the challah that as you braid it, like the chains on the choshen that held those filling stones together on the breast, between the ephod and the breastplate, you can see that challah does have that braided chain-like appearance. The difference is that on high holy days, such as Rosh Hashanah, instead of braiding a straight chain, it'll go around and around. It'll actually make a circle, like a crown. So again, here's this root for chain. Shashara, shasharot, depends on how you're using it in the sentence, but it's from sheresh, which is Strong's 8327. Those of you listening on the recording want to look it up. But again, it's a contronym. That's why I wanted to show you the contronym of filling, male. Because we could see it had a positive connotation, fill the earth, make it fruitful, multiply, be blessed. But it also had the opposite side, which was the earth was male. It was full of violence. So they weren't fulfilling their purpose. They were doing they were filling it up with the opposite sort of thing. So for the chain, shashara, shasharot, it can mean to take root and to flourish. But it can also mean to be uprooted. But that's what makes it a contronym. You have to read it in context to know whether this root word, this shurish, means to take root and flourish, or whether it means to be uprooted. So let's look at some examples here of the shoresh, which, remember, the whole reason we're looking at the root of shoresh is because it's the root of the chain. It's the root of the choshen. We want to know what's going on with this breastplate. And I know we're not going to decode it tonight, but we can begin by kind of deconstructing the words to see what was going on with these gemstones in the Choshen. We know that it had to be held in place with chains. So we go back to the root of the chain. So here's the contronym of the chains and the roots. And it's actually going to kind of follow the pattern there of, there's a book of life that's spoken of throughout Scripture. And one's name can be written in the book of life. It says from the foundation of the world. But yet, there's also a reference to a name being blotted out. It could have been there, but then it could have been uprooted from its place. So let's look at some of the uses. Job 5:3 says, I have seen the foolish taking root, and I cursed his abode. 31:8 says, let me sow and another eat, and let my crops be uprooted. And then he gets down to 31:12, and it gets really bad. It says, for it would be a fire that consumes to Abaddon, and would uproot all my increase. So the idea here is getting stronger of what it means to be uprooted. So if we're going to be chained to something, then we have to be careful that the opposite is not happening, like it happened with Male, where instead of fulfilling the purpose of day 5 and 6 of creation, instead we fill up the earth with violence instead of with peace, which is going to go back to, again, Male is a synonym for shalem. Like shalom, peace. Well, the full context of that, it means fullness, completeness, perfection. So there's a progression here where in the book of Job, we can see that something had a root. Something was chained in a good way. But it can be uprooted. In the case of the fool, he's saying, oh no, it's the fool taking root. Not crops, not things that can grow the matzah and so forth. But instead of something positive taking root, a fool is taking root. All right. He's saying, on the other hand, I have these crops, I had these good things, but now he's saying somebody else is eating my crops. He says, my crops are going to be uprooted, and then all my increase is going to be uprooted. In other words, this is very prophetic, which for Job, it didn't turn out like that. All right, it was better than it sounds. But we get the idea that a shoresh can mean to either put down good, solid roots, or it can mean the uprooting of those roots. Psalm 52:5. It says, but God will break you down forever. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living. Wow. So your tent could have put down roots, but yet he can uproot you from the land of the living. Psalm 89. You cleared the ground before it, and it took deep root and filled the land. Okay, there's your positive side of the contronym. When you plant something and it takes a deep root instead of a shallow root, then what is it doing? It's filling the land. It's fulfilling its purpose when it puts down a deep root. So we've got these chains here that represent the roots. And what are they going to do? They're going to help the land to fulfill its purpose. Why? Because things are going to be planted. Fruitful things are going to be planted in the land. They're going to take root and they're not going to be uprooted. Isaiah 27:6. It says, in the days to come, Jacob will take root, Israel will blossom and sprout, and they will fill the whole world with fruit. Now see, right there, we probably have Isaiah's summary of those gemstones, of the filling stones. What was the purpose of the filling stones? The same purpose that was given on day 5 and 6 of creation. Take root, blossom, sprout, fill the whole world with fruit. But what can happen? If they're not fulfilling their purpose, if the roots don't go down properly, or I'm going to say if the roots don't go up properly, let's just flip everything upside down. Let me bend your mind and dump it upside down. What if the roots don't really down? What if the roots go up? Because as we look at the tree of life in the book of Revelation, we know it's up, it's not down. So truly, our spiritual roots are in the heavenlies. You can put down roots in the earth, but if you don't have corresponding roots in the heavenly, then even that which you have on earth can be uprooted. And that's what Isaiah 40:24 says. It says, scarcely have they been planted, scarcely have they been sown, scarcely has their stock taken root in the earth, but he merely blows them away and they wither. The storm carries them away, the stubble. So that's telling us that your roots have to go deeper than the earth. Your roots have to go all the way up to the heavenlies. They have to go all the way back to the garden in Genesis 2. That's where you want your trees. That's where you want your plants. That's where you want your fine wheat. That's where you want the roots to be. And so the chain is coming from where? The chain is actually descending down to the Hoshen on each side. So you've got these chains coming down. Why? Because your roots are in the heavenlies. Jeremiah 12:2, it says, you have planted them. They have also taken root. They grow. They have even produced fruit. You are near to their lips, but far from their mind. Wow. So what's he saying? You could actually produce some fruit, but it's shallow. And like Isaiah is saying back here, when the storm comes, when he just blows on them, they're going to wither up and blow away. But here he said, okay, they've taken root, they can grow, they can even produce fruit. But if you're only on their lips but far from their minds, that's not an advantage. And what it's using there as mind is kliya, and kliya is a kidney. So in ancient times, the kidney represented your mind, the deepest thoughts of your mind. And that is exactly what you see in the ordination kidneys. In the Torah portion, they're going to put the kidneys on the altar. Why? Because they represent your innermost thoughts. And so you burn the kidneys into a smoke that's going to ascend. Why? Because if you're just throwing stuff on the altar, then you're not putting up roots in the heavenlies. You're only taking root on earth. But there is a certain mindfulness that has to go with all our commandment keeping. I mean, that's the title of the Torah portion, is Tetzaveh, command. So when we're keeping commandments, we have to keep them with mindfulness. You can mumble a blessing and stick the food in your mouth, And you can have a shallow root there. At least you're acknowledging the sovereignty of the Holy One who supplied you with that food to stick in your mouth. But we all understand that we can make a blessing on our food, or we can say a blessing after meals with mindfulness, not just rushing through it to get it done for the sake of formality, but actually mindfully thinking about the words that are coming out of our mouths. It's deep thoughtfulness. So when we take deep mindfulness about keeping a commandment, then the roots don't just go down, the roots go up. They go up in smoke. That's the whole idea. They're going up into the heavenlies, to the true root. And see here it says, Exodus 29:13, you shall take all the fat that covers the entrails and the lobe of the liver and the 2 kidneys, sakliot, and the fat that is on them, and offer them up in smoke. Smoke there is katar, on the altar. So what are you offering? Kidneys. You're offering your mindfulness, because what's going to happen when you keep that commandment, and in this case, the context is consecration of a priesthood. Do you just want to be somewhere with shallow roots? Or do you want to have your roots in the heavenlies and be a part of a nation of priests? There's a difference. Because a nation of priests go through a consecration of mindfulness. And in that mindfulness, in their obedience, that smoke goes up, and you're extending and connecting those chains, those roots, in heavenly spiritual places, not just on the earth. Exodus 29:22 says, you shall also take the fat from the ram, and the fat tail, and the fat that covers the entrails, and the lobe of the liver, and again, the 2 kidneys, sakliot, and the fat that is on them, and the right thigh, for it is a ram of ordination. And where it says ordination, that Hebrew word there is miluim, and you can hear male. You can hear the same root as the filling stones of the Choshen. Why? Because it's the job of the stone to fulfill its purpose as good gold, as not only good gold, but as pure, transparent, undiluted gold. And miluim, another construct from male, so it's a ram of ordination, it's a ram of perfection. In other words, this ram is filling up the purpose that the priest is supposed to have. So it's going to go up in smoke. Again, right? It's the mindfulness. A priest cannot be an unthinking individual when it comes to commandments. A priest has to be mindful when they keep the commandments. Why? Because people are looking at the priest as the example. So we have to be prepared if we are a nation of priests and ministers of reconciliation, the fact that the world is looking at us. And if our roots are going to be exposed, because we'll be uprooted in a day when the wind barely blows. But if our roots have extended all the way up into the heavenlies, why? Because of the ram of miluim. It's a ram that says, I accept this ordination. That means I consecrate my life to fulfill my purpose on earth. I promise not to fill it with violence. I promise not to fill it with mindlessness and keeping your commandments, but I promise to be mindful and connect every commandment I keep on earth to always seek after the spiritual, to allow that chain of the Choshen to connect me to the heavenlies. Just a rote act of obedience is not extending your roots back up into the garden. It can be uprooted. That's the caution. How are we doing on time? Bad. Okay.